Hello, I'm Dr. Nick Sutton and I'm in the library here at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, which is on Magdalen Street in the centre of Oxford. Right, now I want to turn to consider what we might refer to as modern trends in Hindu thought, and particularly the substantial transformations that have taken place in the Hindu world over the last 100 years. I'm going to touch briefly on some of the major figures, people like Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekananda, and then Mahatma Gandhi. But before looking at them as individuals, I want to try and consider the circumstances, the environment, and the political conditions which gave rise to them adopting the teachings and the positions that they did do. We're aware from our understanding of the history of India that certainly by 1800 to 1850, the whole of India had fallen under British rule, supplanting the previous anarchy and prior to that Islamic rule of almost all of India. The British attitude towards Hinduism was initially one of just letting Hindus carry on with it. They were, after all, there to make money, to exploit the riches of India, and the feeling was that if we let the people to practice their religion as they want, then that'll keep them happy, so we can go on printing money out of this country. Towards the end of the 19th century, you've got an evangelical movement in Britain, which puts pressure on the government and the East India Company to allow missionaries to become active in India, and so you've got an intense period, perhaps maybe right up till the middle of the 20th century, an intense period of missionary activity. And simultaneously, from the beginning of the 19th century, we've got the beginnings of the nationalist movement, which seeks to liberate India from British rule. And it's in that context that we see the modern teachers of Hinduism formulating their ideas and working towards religious reform. Okay, I would suggest that both the secular rulers of India, the British rulers of India, and the Christian missionaries saw it as useful to systematically denigrate all native customs. I think it was Governor Macaulay who famously said that all the books ever written in Sanskrit and Persian were not equal in value to one shelf of a decent European library. And that attitude is predominant, obviously, from the missionaries. They're old-style Christians, they're Christian supremacists. They believe that Christianity is the one true faith and that all other religions, including Hinduism, are either gross errors of primitive, stupid people, or else perhaps works of the devil to lead people towards hell. They certainly believe that every Hindu, and every Muslim for that matter, was destined for eternal damnation. I don't know what sort of God they believed in. He certainly wasn't a particularly pleasant character, damning and torturing. But that was the belief, that unless the Hindus converted to Christianity, they were going to be damned. And a part of Christian preaching was not just to glorify Christ, the revelation of Christ, but to try and point out the shortcomings, the faults of the Hindu revelation. Similarly, the British rulers of India, British are peculiar imperialists, perhaps a little bit unlike the French and certainly unlike the Germans, who were pretty much open about it, why they were there. They wanted to control, dominate and exploit. The British had this kind of vision expressed by Kipling in his words, "Take up the white man's burden," that somehow British imperialism was for the benefit of the Indians. We're here to help you. We're here to bestow upon you the gifts of European civilization. It's not we're here to rip you off and take all your money and control you. We're here to, we're spreading. It's a bit like the Red Cross or something, to spread the benefits of our civilization to you. Of course it can't. They're there for one reason. They're there to make money, and that comes out at different times, like when Dyer mows down people in Amritsar in 1921. underneath the velvet glove there's an iron fist to British rule, but still there's an ideology of imperialism, and this is justified, as we maybe some of the accounts of Gandhi's negotiations with the British, by the British statement that, well, we'd like you to rule yourselves, but it's just not possible because you're not civilized enough for self-rule. When you've had maybe another 100 years or 200 years of good British civilizing, then you'll be up to our stand, then we can maybe leave. So, in a sense, the British justify their imperialistic presence by a parallel denigration of native culture and native religion. So, for nationalist reasons and for religious reasons, Hinduism is under attack, not direct physical attack, but ideological, verbal attack from the religious and secular leaders of the British presence in India. And many of the leaders of the reform movement and the nationalist movement, you mentioned Aurobindo, etc., were people who had been educated by the British. Swami Vivekananda, educated in Calcutta, was a student of European philosophy, an expert on Hegel, I think, in his earlier teenage years. And they are aware of British attitudes towards the Hindu tradition. And there are certain areas in particular that the British condemnation focuses on in terms of Hindu society, Hindu religious practice. British people were quite admiring of texts like the Gita. In fact, some Christians claim that the Gita must be a Christian work. Like Hindus couldn't possibly have made this up. It's too good to be Hindu. It must have been some Indian Christians who wrote it for them, and maybe the Upanishads as well, if they could understand them. But what they really focused it on was practices, particularly in relation to Hindu women, gender, not that Victorian women were treated that well, and also caste, which they regarded as iniquitous. And you've got this sort of stream of Hindu horror stories coming back to Britain, things like the human sacrifice at the Jagannath temple. We still have in British, we've still got the word juggernaut, which we talk about a big lorry, and that comes into the Victorian vocabulary because we're getting these horror stories at the Jagannath temple. The priests offer human sacrifice to the bloodthirsty idol. The writings are still, you can still see them. In fact, what had happened is a few people had fallen over because there was such a big crowd and got crushed. But the story that came back was human sacrifice. We've got things like the thugs. We still use the word in English, a thug. This kind of Kali worshipping, devilish cult of human sacrifice. Again, it wasn't true. The thugs were just bandits, really, and some of them were Muslims. So there wasn't a Kali worshipping devil cult or anything like that. But still, this comes filtering back. And then you've got sati as well, the mass slaughter of widows. It did happen, but on a very limited scale. But it was in the British interest, missionary and secular, to exaggerate the iniquities of the Hindu system, and the caste system as well was regarded as hugely iniquitous. Although, has to be said, the Victorian society was, even in Britain, was largely caste-based and utterly discriminatory against the lower social classes. Nonetheless, Hindus who sought to liberate India from British rule accepted the validity of certain criticisms, and they therefore saw the nationalist struggle as being a part, as a part of the nationalist struggle, the need to transform Hinduism into a form of religiosity, a form of spirituality that would be acceptable to the modern world, which would demonstrate quite clearly that India was a great civilization that certainly should be allowed to rule itself. So in a sense, nationalism and reform go hand in hand, and we see this particularly in a figure like Mahatma Gandhi, who is known for being the leader of the Indian nationalist movement, but at the same time was absolutely committed to social reform. Let's look then. And I think it's, the criticisms weren't entirely fabricated. I think what you find is that when a society, a culture and a religion is under pressure from outside domination, as Hinduism had been for many centuries of Islamic rule, it tends to become hidebound and rule-bound. It loses its spontaneity. and becomes conservative and inward looking, and therefore rules of caste, rules of gender had become solidified and rigid in a way that they never had been in the past. But nonetheless, there were practices that we would regard as iniquitous, and not really even in the ancient past either. I mean, I was in Kerala a few months ago, and I was reading there about how some of the temples there, not just the temples but the roads to the temples, had been barred to the lower classes. And this is talking about the 20s and the 30s. I think it was the Guruvayur temple was stormed by members of the lower castes in the 1930s who sought to gain access to them. That was barred. I can even recall a gentleman who used to come to one of our classes in London, quite an elderly gentleman. When we were talking about this, he said he could remember in his childhood in India growing up and seeing people standing outside the temple who were barred admission to the temple. So there were practices that we modern people, Hindu and non-Hindu alike, would regard today as wholly unacceptable. I think Gandhi in the 20s, when he was campaigning for the right of widows to remarry, he pointed out that there were, I think the figure was 330,000 widows in India under the age of 15. And that means women, girls, children really, who would never be allowed to remarry, but would have to eke out a miserable existence as widows. Clearly, iniquitous practices, but these were seized upon by the British rulers to justify their presence, and by the missionaries in order to justify a demand for conversion to Christianity and escape from the iniquities of Hindu dharma. So the reformers are closely connected to the nationalist movement and the restoration of India's pride in its own culture. Let's just mention, time is limited, I want to mention particularly perhaps three individual figures and place them within that context, and try and demonstrate the way in which they sought to reform the Hindu tradition. Now, in his book, which is about the history of Christianity, David Chidester, it's quite a thick tome on the world history of Christianity, when he writes about Christianity in India, he entitles his chapter Hindu Christians, and he talks about people like Vivekananda, Gandhi, Ram Mohan Roy as being Hindu Christians. His contention is that it was Christianity that was the driving impetus for people like Dayananda, Gandhi, Vivekananda. They were inspired by Christianity. Of course, they didn't convert to Christianity, but their inspiration towards reform of Hinduism came from Christian sources. Now, I would say Chidester is completely wrong there. He is wrong. I don't want to be too critical, but I don't think he really understands Hinduism, because the point I'm going to make is that all of these figures, with perhaps the possible exception of Ram Mohan Roy, were entirely Hindu, and the resources, the intellectual, spiritual, religious resources that they used in order to reform and transform the tradition in which they lived were entirely Hindu. And let's look at that with that idea in mind to demonstrate I'm not saying there was no Western influence upon them, and maybe Western criticisms provided something of an impetus, but the way they reformed Hinduism was not by making reference to some outside source of authority or teaching. They looked within their own tradition and reformed by using resources from within their own tradition. Let's talk first of all about Dayananda Saraswati, and the details of his life we can pick up from other sources. Dayananda Saraswati is well known as the founder of the Arya Samaj. Interesting history. He lived an early life of a sannyasi, travelling all around India. He's famously born into a Shaivite family, but after staying awake all night at Shivaratri and seeing, I think, rodents, I'm not sure whether it was mice or rats, prefer to think of mice, they're not quite as repulsive as rats, but anyway, he was watching the altar and he saw the offerings being eaten by rodents. He then came to the conclusion that the murti could not be a true manifestation of God. So he campaigned against what he saw as later additions to the pristine Hinduism. And he rejected caste, he rejected discrimination against women, and he also rejected murti puja, the worship of images in temple. And still to this day, the Arya Samaj ritual is based on the fire yajna, the Vedic ritual, and not the later ritual of murti puja. Now, the crux of Dayananda's argument here, and I am summarising, his argument is far more involved than that. The crux of his argument is not that we should stop doing these things because we should start listening to the Christians, just the opposite. He had no time for Christianity or Islam, and in fact his book Satyartha Prakash, in chapters I think 11 and 12, he has a systematic demolition. He's quite a, what would you say, a vituperative speaker, quite acerbic in his language, Dayananda, very critical. He equally dismisses Christianity and Islam as nonsensical, and indeed later Hinduism. But his point is, Hinduism should be the Hinduism of the Veda. He's not looking outside Hinduism, he's looking within Hinduism and saying, let's go back to our original, pure, perfect Vedic religion and get rid of all this other stuff. He calls it Puranic religion. So he rejects all notion, and Ram Mohan Roy earlier was similar in this respect, an admirer of the Upanishads, a rejecter of ritual and later notions. So he rejects even the notion of avatar, he rejects murti puja, he rejects caste, he rejects gender inequality on the basis that these features of contemporary Hinduism are not Vedic. And he's right in that sense. The Veda, the Upanishads, the Shruti does not refer to murti puja. There is one verse, I think, of one Vedic hymn, I might be right, there might be other references as well, which refers to the Varna system, which is the division of society into 4 social classes. No reference, though, to the caste system within the Veda. There's that one hymn, the Purusha Sukta, which refers in one verse to it. Elsewhere, through the vast corpus of Vedic literature, caste doesn't play a part. So Dayananda's point is, it's not Hinduism, it's a social system that has evolved in India for practical purposes, but Hindus don't have to practice that. It's not Hindu. So therefore the criticism of Hindu from outside is misplaced. Real Hinduism doesn't do this. Moreover, he points out that, and again he's right in this, he says that the Vedic injunction on performing of the Vedic ritual demand that a man and his wife, the yajman, the performer, not the priest but the sponsor of the yajna, who sits at the centre, must have his wife by his side. We may recall in the Ramayana at the end, after Ram has banished Sita and he wants to do I think an Ashwamedh yajna, he can't do it because he hasn't got a wife, and so they say to him, marry someone else. He won't, because he's still devoted to Sita. So they have, I think, a gold murti of Sita made to sit next to him. But the point that Dayananda would make was, in Vedic society, in the Vedic religion, there was no discrimination against women at all. Men and women performed the ritual as equal co-partners. Sahadharmini, it's mentioned in the Mahabharata as well. They're perfectly equal. And this discrimination against women, things like sati, the relegation of women to a position of constitutional inferiority that was the case in India, that is not Vedic. That is a later accretion, an addition, and that Hinduism should reform itself by going back to its original Vedic roots. So again, I'll go back to that point. It's not Hindu-Christian. It's a Hindu looking to his own ancient tradition in order to reform it and return it, as he saw it, to its original pristine condition. Now, one might be somewhat critical of the Arya Samaj and Dayananda, particularly over murti puja, and in fact murti puja is and remains a major facet of Hindu ritual. And in fact, my experience has been that the Arya Samaj position against murti puja has somewhat moderated. They don't do it. They still do the Vedic yajna. But they're not overtly critical of temples where it's practiced. Certainly that's the case in Birmingham. I don't know if it's typical generally, but I think the Arya Samaj today has a slightly different demeanour, and they are very committed to the nationalist Hindu cause, but the original lines of reform established by Dayananda were based on this call to go back to the Veda. Right, let's move on to another major figure whose biography we can trace. Dayananda this is Swami Vivekananda, Narendranath Dutt, as he was born. And whereas Dayananda Saraswati is a Gujarati from the northwest of India, Swami Vivekananda is a Bengali, I think from the city of Calcutta, the son of a Calcutta lawyer. Interesting stories. His life is fascinating. He didn't live to any great age. I think he died before the age of 40 after major preaching work. Okay, we can look at Dayananda's life and work. Again, there's a comic on the subject we can read out, and his travels to the United States and Europe preaching Hindu Dharma. But in terms of the reform of Hindu society, and particularly Dayananda, unlike Dayananda, Vivekananda didn't reject Murti Puja entirely. He saw it as useful for people who needed that form of practice, and the stories which demonstrate that he did feel that Murti Puja was a reasonable thing to do for people who need it. But on issues of caste and on issues of gender, he was very emphatic again. Now, in demanding reform and upliftment for the lower classes. Let's look at Vivekananda. The Ramakrishna mission that he established is well known in India for its philanthropic activities. I went to the Ramakrishna mission in Trivandrum to visit, and it's a hospital. You go in there and it's like going into a hospital reception, and there's a sadhu sitting there checking people into hospital, because that's what they do. That's their that's their religious practice, is helping people. It's very much of a philanthropic organisation. So where does this come from? Is this again Christians telling us you should love one another, or the secular humanists? Not at all. Vivekananda is a Vedantist, and by and large a neo-Vedantist who follows Shankaracharya. His point is that Shankaracharya and Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, teaches the inner divinity of every living being. So each one of us is essentially a part or wholly identical with Brahman, the Absolute. Therefore, for Vivekananda, worship of God, respect for God, means service to humanity. Because if I serve you, if I lift you up, if I feed you, I am directly, actively serving God, because you are a manifestation of the divine. So very interesting talks by Swami Vivekananda. They are recorded in the complete work. Some of his lectures are absolutely fascinating. Fabulous stuff he's saying. There's one talk where I think he's addressing an assembly who seem to be high caste, and he says it's very easy for us to stand here and talk glibly about Vedanta this, Upanishads this, but then you walk out of this hall and you see a man of the lower caste and you feel contempt. You look down and stay away from me, don't come near me. He said, but that means you haven't understood the first word of what I've been saying about Vedanta. Because if you really understand Vedanta, you won't see a person who is lower than you. You will see a manifestation of Brahman, and you will show reverence. You will do everything you can to render service to that person. Vivekananda called this constructive Vedanta, which means that you apply the mystical theology of Shankaracharya to a context of social reform. The rational conclusion of the Vedantic idea of inner divinity is that you serve all of humanity. So there is a connection there, but it took Vivekananda really to make that connection. It wasn't entirely new. I was reading again in the Shankara Digvijay. There's a story about Shankaracharya walking down the road with his disciples, and a fellow of the very lowest caste comes in the opposite direction. So the disciples run and say, get out of the way, get out of the way. The great Shankaracharya is coming, and he says, and the low caste person, who's actually a manifestation of Shiva pretending to be low caste, but he says, well, if you think everyone's Brahman, why are you taking this sort of attitude? And Shankaracharya says, actually this man has great spiritual knowledge. So Vivekananda's idea wasn't entirely new, but he really put it into application again. Same thing with the treatment of Hindu women. He says something like, I will not rest until I've rooted out this discrimination on the basis of gender. He says, is there any gender in the Atman all we can say, and here he quotes Katha Upanishad, is asti, asti, it is, it is. In other words, you're seeing she is a woman, she's lower than me. But that means, again, you don't understand Vedanta, because Vedanta is, I see Brahman, manifestations of Brahman. Therefore, what he's saying is that form of discrimination, abuse of other people, is completely incompatible with the realization of absolute oneness that is inherent in the Advaita interpretation of Vedanta. So he's using, again, resources that are entirely Hindu in order to demand the reform of Hindu society and social welfare work on behalf of those who are disadvantaged. Vivekananda's writings are well worth reading. A wonderful speaker as well. Anyway, we haven't got time to spend too much time on Vivekananda. But it's worth reading, for example, the newspaper accounts of Vivekananda's speech in Chicago in the 1890s, where an American newspaper journalist compares him to Christ and says how fortunate we are to be in the presence of this man. So a very charismatic figure. But again, it's very interesting how he uses Vedanta to as the basis for his call for the reform of Hindu society. And finally, we must, before we finish, mention Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who is still regarded as the founder of the modern state of India. I've got him from my wad of 500 rupee notes. There was a picture of Gandhi on the back with the nation marching on behind him. I think attitudes towards Gandhi have certainly changed perhaps in the last 20 or 30 years, but nonetheless a figure of an object of great respect. Gandhi is known, I think, for leading the independence movement, the Indian National Congress, against British rule. But he's also famous for his efforts to reform Hindu society. Gandhi, interestingly, claimed that all of his political activity, all of his social welfare activity, were based on his religious and spiritual inspiration. He says he wasn't a religious politician, he was a religious person. Gandhi's principal notion, and again it's a contentious one and we haven't got scope here to debate it fully, was the notion of ahimsa, non-harming other living beings. And again, it's not an idea that Gandhi invented. It's there in the Gita, perhaps paradoxically. It's also referred to in the Upanishads. Frequently in the Mahabharata discourses we'll read ahimsa paramo dharma, the highest. Well, I think somewhere it says the mark, the characteristic of the presence of dharma is ahimsa. So Gandhi didn't invent ahimsa, but his idea, and it's an interesting idea, is that ahimsa and spirituality, spiritual realization, are identical. Because his point is that harming others, himsa, will arise in your consciousness only when you are in the materialistic domain. One who rises to the spiritual level, the level of realization the Upanishads talk about, is inherently non-harming of others. This is found in the Isha Upanishad. I can't remember the exact verse, maybe verse 2 or 3 of the Isha Upanishad. It says, when you have that realization of the universal Atman, you never have any contempt, any desire to harm another, because after all, we're not different, we're all one, and therefore there can be no harming. So that was Gandhi's idea, that ahimsa was the characteristic of one who has acquired spiritual realization, because I will only harm you because of my lack of spiritual realization. When I have the realization, I don't want anything, I don't desire anything, I have no selfishness, I have no greed, I have no hankering, I have no hatred, I have no anger. I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about ultimately when I reach that realization. Then how can such a person ever do harm? So ahimsa is then identical with absolute spiritual realization. So Gandhi takes that fundamental principle of Hindu spirituality, which has been around from ancient times and runs throughout Hindu teaching, and he applies that. It's not, again, he's read Christianity, he's read the Sermon on the Mount, he's corresponded with Tolstoy, but it's not that influence that is inspiring him, it's his understanding of the centrality of ahimsa to Hindu teaching, which again inspires him, not just against the British as well, because he says the British are in India because they're greedy, violent, aggressive people who want to rob the Indians. therefore they should leave because that's the right thing to do. But similarly, he says, people who persecute the lower classes, oppress them, drive them out and stop them sharing wells and things like that, they are also violating the fundamental Hindu principle of ahimsa. People who discriminate against women, who abuse women, who deprive women of their rights, they also are contravening the fundamental Hindu principle of ahimsa. Therefore, caste-based discrimination, gender-based discrimination are anti-Hindu. They are completely at odds with Hindu teaching. Vivekananda saying the same thing. You can't be like that. You can't discriminate. You can't abuse. You can't have contempt and despise any people if you are properly realised in the Hindu sense. Okay, so I've just really 3 short snapshots there of modern, or semi-modern Hindu reformers, who each in their own way. Dayananda by going back to the Veda, Vivekananda by talking about the inner divinity of every living being, and Mahatma Gandhi with his emphasis on the principle of the Hindu principle of ahimsa, use these exclusively Hindu resources in order to reform Hindu society. And that's why I will go back to the point again. When Chidesta describes these people as Hindu Christians, he's made a fundamental error. Not wishing to be harmful. He is a wonderful scholar, and his knowledge of Christian history is perhaps unrivaled. But when he moves into the field of studying Hinduism, I think he makes a slight mistake on that, and he sees elements within Hinduism which are somewhat akin to Christianity, and he presumes it must be a Christian influence, whereas in fact, as we've seen even in this brief discourse, the actual resources that are used by modern Hindus are exclusively and entirely Hindu in their attempts to change Hindu society. Okay. Thank you very much. Comes out at different times, like when Dyer mows down people in Amritsar in 1921. There's underneath the velvet glove there's an iron fist to British rule, but still there's an ideology of imperialism, and this is justified, as maybe some of the accounts of Gandhi's negotiations with the British, by the British statement that, well, we'd like you to rule yourselves, but it's just not possible because you're not civilised enough for self-rule. When you've had maybe another 100 years or 200 years of good British civilising, then you'll be up to our standard, then we can maybe leave. So, in a sense, the British justify their imperialistic presence by a parallel denigration of native culture and native religion. So for nationalist reasons and for religious reasons, Hinduism is under attack, not direct physical attack, but ideological, verbal attack from the religious and secular leaders of the British presence in India. And many of the leaders of the reform movement and the nationalist movement, you mentioned Aurobindo, nationalist movement which seeks to liberate India from British rule, and it's in that context that we see the modern teachers of Hinduism formulating their ideas and working towards religious reform. Okay, I would suggest that both the secular rulers of India, the British rulers of India, and the Christian missionaries saw it as useful to systematically denigrate all native customs. I think it was Governor Macaulay who famously said that all the books ever written in Sanskrit and Persian were not equal in value to one shelf of a decent European library. And that attitude is predominant. Obviously from the missionaries, they're old-style Christians, they're Christian supremacists, they believe that Christianity is the one true faith and that all other religions, including Hinduism, are either gross errors of primitive, stupid people, or else perhaps works of the devil to lead people towards hell. They certainly believed that every Hindu, and every Muslim for that matter, was destined for eternal damnation. Don't know what sort of God they believed in. He certainly wasn't a particularly pleasant character, damning and torturing forever. But that was the belief, that unless the Hindus converted to Christianity, they were going to be damned. And a part of Christian preaching was not just to glorify Christ, the revelation of Christ, but to try and point out the shortcomings, the faults of the Hindu revelation. Similarly, the British rulers of India, British are peculiar imperialists. Perhaps a little bit unlike the French, and certainly unlike the Germans, who were pretty much open about it, why they were there. They wanted to control, dominate and exploit. The British had this kind of vision expressed by Kipling in his words, "Take up the white man's burden," that somehow British imperialism was for the benefit of the Indians. We're here to help you. We're here to bestow upon you the gifts of European civilization. It's not we're here to rip you off and take all your money and control you. We're here to, we're spreading. It's a bit like the Red Cross or something, to spread the benefits of our civilization to you. Of course it can't. They're there for one reason. They're there to make money. And that understanding of the history of India, that certainly by 1800 to 1850, the whole of India had fallen under British rule, supplanting the previous anarchy and prior to that Islamic rule of almost all of India. The British attitude towards Hinduism was initially one of just letting Hindus carry on with it. They were, after all, there to make money, to exploit the riches of India, and the feeling was that if we let the people to practice their religion as they want, then that will keep them happy, so we can go on printing money out of this country. Towards the end of the 19th century, you've got an evangelical movement in Britain, which puts pressure on the government and the East India Company to allow missionaries to become active in India. And so you've got an intense period, perhaps maybe right up till maybe the middle of the 20th century, an intense period of missionary activity. And simultaneously, from the beginning of the 19th century, we've got the beginnings of the... Hello, I'm Dr. Nick Sutton, and I'm in the library here at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, which is on Magdalen Street in the centre of Oxford. Right, now I want to turn to consider what we might refer to as modern trends in Hindu thought, and particularly the substantial transformations that have taken place in the Hindu world over the last 100 years. I'm going to touch briefly on some of the major figures, people like Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekananda, and then Mahatma Gandhi. But before looking at them as individuals, I want to try and consider the circumstances, the environment, and the political conditions which gave rise to them adopting the teachings and the positions that they did do. We're aware from our understanding